So our microflora are all of our tiny, plants is the wrong word, but it's the term we use for the organisms that are living in soils that aren't moving around like animals. We call them soil flora. So this includes the tiny little root hairs on vascular plants. They're only one cell thick and they interact with the other microflora, like the fungi and bacteria that are in the soil. We even have some places where there are archaea, which is kind of like bacteria and kind of not. And we'll specifically talk about cyanobacteria and actinomycetes, which are both types of bacteria, but deserve their own category. This is a picture of an iron oxidizing bacteria that's common in soils, especially anaerobic soils. And whenever you have areas where water goes from deoxygenated to oxygenated, you will frequently see these iron oxidizing bacteria all of a sudden start oxidizing, and they make this like slimy rust coating. It's fairly common because we have a lot of iron in our soil around here. So just a quick review of the macroflora we were talking about in the last lecture. We have large roots like tap roots, and we have smaller branching roots, and then at the ends of all of those, they're covered in tiny little root hairs. This is surface area, kind of like how your lungs and then alveoli have the surface area to do the respiration. Those chemical transfers are happening in the tiny one-cell root hairs. Roots, this is, again, I just talked about this. For me, I just talked about this. You might be watching this a week later. But the roots are really important in soil creation, soil stabilization, nutrient cycling, water conservation. Plant roots, vascular plant roots, are one of the most important components of the majority of soils on this planet. There are certain soils that are defined by the amount of vascular material that is in them. But I just wanted to go over that again before we get into our things like fungi. So fungi are their own kingdom, and they're different than animals, they're different than plants, they're different than anything else we know of. They are able to decompose cellulose and lignin, which is important because most animals and plants cannot decompose cellulose and lignin. Those are very hard to break down molecules. We talked about earlier how termites do this by having bacteria in their gut flora. So many funguses can do this. So I need to sort of point out this is part of our microflora and not our macroflora, because we associate funguses with these beautiful structures above ground, but those are just the berries. The majority of the fungus is a microflora root system of hyphae, which is what this brown picture is showing. They are microscopic little root systems that you can barely see. That's the majority of the fungus. These mushrooms that we see above ground, that's just like the blueberry of the plant, the apple. It's the fruiting body. It's temporary, it's fleeting, it's only the tip of the iceberg. So we include fungus in the microflora of the soil. And funguses, their fruiting bodies are a huge food source to a lot of macro creatures, but the hyphae underground are also a large food source to a lot of the microfauna. And fungus usually help keep the carbon to nitrogen ratio high, where we have lots of carbon. Funguses are pretty particular about where they live. Bacteria have adapted to many different environments. Fungus are more picky. They want oxygen. So you will find fewer fungus in anaerobic soils. You'll find them in aerobic soils. So there's fewer funguses growing in wetlands, for example, because the soils tend to be more anaerobic. They are very tolerant of acidic environments, however, which bacteria and actinomycetes, because they're a type of bacteria, are not. So funguses like our acidic forests of northern Ontario. We have several different species that grow here. They also are surprisingly tolerant of drought. So bacteria and protists that have small, fragile cell walls and cell membranes need that water so they don't dehydrate. And although they can create cysts to survive out those periods of drought, funguses are way better at staying alive through those drought periods. Plants as well can be active through those drought periods. Majority of soil funguses do not like disturbed soils. So what that means, harkening back to our last lecture, is here in the northern forests of Ontario, they do not like earthworms. You'll see fewer of the funguses that we know and love in an earthworm area than you will in a place lacking that. They also don't like you digging and all those sorts of things. And that's because you're disturbing their hyphae. You might not be able to see their hyphae, but you're disturbing those hyphae. And that's why they don't like those disturbances in the soil. We do have some fungus that are pathogens. They can cause lots of agricultural blights, are caused by different funguses on the plants. But some of them actually can fight diseases. So this is a fungus that I learned about in my microbiology class years ago that actually traps nematodes. So the nematodes cause a disease in the plant, and the fungus traps the nematode. So it actually fights that disease. And most importantly to our forests here is the majority of trees and plants have symbiotic relationships with fungus. And we call this mycorrhiza. And the hyphae root systems of the fungus intertwine with the vascular root systems of the plants to create a huge network. So both of those organisms then have larger surface area for uptake of nutrients. So a common fungus that you might see, this is a wild yeast. I don't know if any of you guys ever made your own sourdough starter, but you can just mix flour and water and leave it out somewhere, and wild yeast that's floating around in the air can then inhabit that starter, and you can start a sourdough bread just from nothing. That wild yeast is also in our soils, and this is typically what it looks like when we get it on a Petri tray. Sadly, I don't think we're going to be able to culture our own soil fungus and bacteria this year. I can't think of a safe way for you guys to do it at home. Maybe I'll come up with one, but right now I can't think of one. But if we did, we would see yeast in the soils around North Bay. So yeasts are fun because they are unicellular and colonial, so you don't see the same hyphae networks with yeast as you do with other funguses. So they're lacking those hyphae.